US President Barack Obama is hosting the first US-Africa Summit. 50 heads of states of African countries will gather at the White House from August the 4th to the 6th, alongside hundreds of diplomats, lobbyists, investors, and CEOs. The summit is a clear sign that Africa's fortunes are on the rise. After 2 decades of stagnations in the 1980s and 1990s, when GDP per capita more or less flatlined, a virtuous cycle of improved governance and high commodity prices have propelled economic growth in the continent. GDP per capita in the region is today 50% higher than it was 2 decades ago. The continent is the second fastest region in the world, only behind the developing Asia region that includes China and India. At 5.8%, Africa will grow this year faster than, for example, Latin America and the Middle East. The US is clearly trying to tap into the economic resurgence. But is it too late for Obama? The European Union and Japan have been cultivating Africa for years, and China, India, Malaysia, Brazil, and other emerging markets are rapidly building a strong base in the continent. China, for example, organized his first Africa Summit 14 years ago, and since then he has organized another 4 summits, the last one in Beijing. I asked Ed Luce, the FT's chief columnist in Washington, why the US has waited so long to host an Africa Summit.
First is that he was attacked very viciously during the 2008 campaign, sometimes by rumor, sometimes directly, for having a father, a Muslim father, who was born in Kenya, in Africa. And he's sought politically to distance himself from that identity. This is an all-American president who happened to be black. And the second was that his whole sort of shtick as president in both election campaigns has been to wind down foreign wars, wind down foreign entanglements, and really pivot to America to focus on the problems at home after the Bush years. And Africa is one of these big, long-term strategic sort of zones of the world that deserves to be addressed, and he has paid, as president, lip service to that, but which hasn't really fit in with the week-to-week, hand-to-mouth agenda that has dominated both of his terms as president.
The long wait for the Africa Summit has disappointed many in the region. A President Obama election was front-page story on the Kenyan newspapers. There was great hopes that President Obama will pay more attention for the region. However, Obama has barely traveled to Africa. He has only visited 5 countries compared to 16 in Europe and a great number in Asia, the Americas, and the Middle East. For The View from Africa, this is Katrina Manson, the FT's East Africa Bureau Chief in Nairobi.
There were high hopes in Africa when the US elected its first African-American president. After all, Mr. Obama's father was from here in Kenya, and his step-grandmother and cousins still live in Western Kenya. But in the entirety of his first term in office, he visited the continent for fewer than 24 hours in a one-stop trip to Ghana. Relations with Kenya have been particularly strained. Mr. Obama is yet to visit his homeland in his capacity as president, and Kenya even accused the US of trying to destabilize the government earlier this year. Still, things look like they may be about to get better. Mr. Kenyatta has accepted an invitation to Washington, among one of 47 leaders on the continent, on good terms with the US.
It may be too late, and probably many in Africa will feel that this is not enough. But this first ever US-Africa Summit at the very least shows one thing, that the continent, long ignored in Washington, is now firmly in the spotlight. Javier Blas, Financial Times, London.